There are legends. And then there's the SR-71 Blackbird, the jet that didn't just fly faster than any aircraft in history. It rewrote what human flight meant. But there was one mission. One so secret that for decades, even its pilots couldn't talk about it. That turned the Blackbird from a classified marvel into an immortal legend. This is the story they never meant for you to hear. It was 1972. The Cold War was at its boiling point. The United States needed answers. And fast. Deep in the heart of enemy territory. Intelligence satellites had spotted something unusual, a vast structure rising out of the Siberian wilderness. The CIA feared it was a new Soviet missile complex, one capable of striking the U.S. mainland. The problem? No one knew what it really was. And there was only one aircraft fast enough, high enough, and stealthy enough to find out before it was too late. The SR-71 was called in. The Blackbird wasn't just a plane. It was a black ghost, designed to fly at over 85,000 feet, and beyond Mach 3. It could outrun any missile ever built. But this mission wasn't about speed alone. It was about survival. The Soviets had just installed a new radar system, capable of tracking targets at unprecedented altitudes. One wrong move, and the Blackbird would become the world's fastest funeral. On a frozen morning at Beale Air Force Base, two men climbed into the sleek black titanium machine. Their names were withheld for decades. Their orders were simple. Reach the site, capture the imagery, return alive. What wasn't said was the truth. There was no backup plan. As the engines roared to life, the air shimmered with heat. The SR-71 thundered into the sky, vanishing into the thin blue edge of space. Crossing into Soviet airspace meant minutes, not hours of safety. Within moments, radar alarms lit up. Soviet interceptors scrambled, missiles armed. The pilot pushed the throttles past limits no engineer dared to test. The jet screamed past Mach 3. Skin temperature, over 600 degrees. Titanium panels expanding, leaking fuel, glowing faintly red. At that altitude, the cockpit was a coffin of fire and silence. But the Blackbird didn't flinch. It climbed higher, until even the Soviet radars began to lose it in the thin veil of the atmosphere. As the cameras rolled, they captured every detail of the mysterious site below. Dozens of missile silos, rail systems, and massive launch domes. Proof that the Soviets were building something far beyond what the world had imagined. Then came the warning. Surface-to-air missile launch. Several, in fact. Alarms blared. The pilot looked back, white plumes rising fast from the ground. He whispered one line into the recorder. Let's see if they can catch a ghost. The throttles slammed forward again. The SR-71 vanished into the horizon, outrunning the missiles with a margin of mere seconds. Hours later, it landed safely. The crew stepped out, their flight suits scorched from heat. The film they carried changed U.S. intelligence forever. The images confirmed the Soviets were testing a new generation of ICBMs. Years ahead of what anyone predicted, that mission's data reshaped American defense strategy. And none of it would have existed without the Blackbird. For decades, the mission was sealed, labeled never exist. But when it was finally declassified, pilots and engineers called it the moment the SR-71 became more than a machine. It became a symbol of human audacity, of what happens when fear meets innovation. The Blackbird didn't just survive the impossible. It redefined it. Even today, no aircraft has ever come close. The SR-71 wasn't built to fight. It was built to know, to see what no one else could see, and to do it before anyone could stop it. That's why the world still calls it what it truly is, a legend born in silence, baptized in fire, and untouchable in the sky. It all began with fear, a quiet, unspoken kind of fear that stretched across oceans and skies. The Cold War wasn't just a race for weapons or technology. It was a race for survival. Every nation wanted to know what the other was doing. And the United States knew that being blind meant being vulnerable. Out of that fear, hidden behind locked hangars and coded memos, something extraordinary was born. A machine designed not for war, but for knowledge. It wasn't built to destroy. It was built to see what no one else could. That machine would become the SR-71 Blackbird. In those years, the air was thick with tension. Soviet missiles were being tested, their shadows stretching toward the west. American intelligence was desperate. The U-2 spy plane had already been shot down, its pilot captured and humiliated on global television. The U.S. needed something that could never be touched, never be seen, never be caught. So they turned to a small team of engineers at Lockheed's secret Skunk Works division, a place where rules didn't exist, and the impossible was just another day at work. The men who designed it called it a black project. The world called it impossible. Titanium that cracked when welded, engines that melted under pressure, and fuel that leaked right through the body when it wasn't flying. Every problem seemed unsolvable. But fear is a powerful motivator. They built an aircraft that could touch the edge of space, traveling faster than any missile that could be fired at it. The Blackbird was the answer to a question the world wasn't ready to ask. Then came the men who would fly it. They weren't ordinary pilots. They were ghosts. Every mission they flew carried the weight of silence. They couldn't tell their families where they were going. They couldn't admit what they had seen. Inside the cockpit, temperatures soared past 600 degrees. The metal groaned. The fuel boiled. The horizon curved below them. At that speed, the earth looked smaller. And so did fear. They knew if something went wrong, no one would ever find them. And still, they flew. One mission would define them all. Over frozen Siberia, the Blackbird screamed into the unknown. Soviet radars locked on. Missiles launched. Sirens screamed through the cockpit. The pilot whispered, "Let's see if they can catch a ghost." At Mach 3, the world outside turned into streaks of light. The Blackbird climbed higher, faster, beyond the range of any weapon. And just like that, it vanished. The film it brought back would reveal secrets that changed global strategy forever. For years, the mission didn't exist. The pilots' names weren't in any record. The data was locked away, under code words and silence. But when the truth finally surfaced, the world realized that this aircraft wasn't just a product of steel and fire. It was built from fear, courage, and genius. The SR-71 wasn't created to conquer. It was created to protect, to outfly the unknown, to prove that human will could defy even the laws of nature. And though it hasn't flown in decades, its legend still does. High above the clouds, faster than sound, untouchable in the sky. They were the men who flew the impossible. They weren't just pilots. They were ghosts of the sky. Men trained to disappear, to exist in a place where even the atmosphere thinned out into silence. The SR-71 Blackbird wasn't just a machine. They controlled. It was a living, breathing beast that demanded everything from them. Their courage, their patience, their sanity. Every time they strapped into that cockpit, they stepped away from the world and into a place where one wrong heartbeat could end it all. There was no margin for error. No second chance, no rescue waiting if something went wrong. Once you were in that suit, sealed under a canopy of titanium and glass, you belonged to the sky and nothing else. The moment the engines roared to life, the air itself seemed to shake. Those pilots felt the vibration in their bones as the afterburners ignited, flooding the runway with blue flames. Inside the cockpit, the world turned to noise and heat. The instruments glowed red. The pressure built and the men had to trust a machine that was barely understood, even by those who built it. The Blackbird would climb, stretching toward the edge of space, and everything inside would begin to change. The heat was unbearable. The walls of the cockpit would glow with the friction of air, tearing against the jet's skin. The pilots' suits were their only barrier from that inferno, and even then, they could feel the radiation of speed pressing against their chest. At 80,000 feet, the world below was no longer blue and green. It was curved and endless. The Earth's horizon faded into black. The stars began to appear, and the sound of the engines became a steady, thunderous heartbeat. The men who sat there didn't talk much. Their oxygen masks hissed softly, their gloved hands steady on the controls. They were at the edge of what the human body could withstand, a place where blood could boil if the pressure seals failed, where a tiny piece of debris could tear through the fuselage like a bullet. Every second was a calculation between life and death. But they didn't fear it. They respected it. They trained for years, knowing that this aircraft could never glide to safety. If something failed, it didn't crash. It vanished. Yet, that was the price of being first, of flying faster than any human had before. These men weren't chosen for bravery alone. They were chosen for calm, for the ability to face death not with fear, but with precision. Their minds had to work like the jet's computers. Logical, sharp, unbreakable. There were moments during missions when the alarms would flash red, when the temperature would spike, and the radar would scream of incoming missiles. At those times, they didn't panic. They didn't pray. They acted. One movement of the throttle, one fraction of a second, and they were gone, slipping through the sky faster than sound itself, leaving chaos behind. For them, survival wasn't luck. It was mastery. When they landed, the silence hit hard. The Blackbird would hiss as it cooled, its skin still too hot to touch. The pilots would remove their helmets, sweat frozen against their skin, faces pale from hours of focus. They'd exchange a single glance, a quiet nod, the kind only men who had touched the edge of death could understand. Then they'd vanish again into the shadows of secrecy, nameless and unrecognized, their victories classified, their courage buried in silence. They weren't chasing fame, and they never sought glory. They did it because someone had to. Because somewhere up there, at the edge of the world, truth waited, and they were the only ones fast enough to reach. The SR-71 wasn't born like other aircraft. It wasn't drawn from blueprints that already existed, or based on engines that had ever flown before. It was created from nothing but imagination, desperation, and the courage to challenge what was thought to be physically impossible. In the heart of Lockheed's secret Skunk Works division, a small group of engineers gathered under dim lights, surrounded by chalkboards filled with equations and calculations that didn't even make sense to conventional science. They were told to build something that couldn't be seen, couldn't be caught, and couldn't be shot down. A plane that would fly so fast and so high that it would outpace the very concept of death. They began with titanium, a metal that was light yet stronger than steel. It was perfect, except for one problem. No one knew how to work with it. It shattered when welded, cracked under stress, and reacted violently to the chemicals used in standard manufacturing. The heat from the engines was so intense that the airframe would expand several inches mid-flight. To solve that, they had to design the plane so loose on the ground that it leaked fuel just sitting there. The SR-71 literally bled out before every mission. The engineers accepted it as the cost of power. An aircraft so advanced it could only hold itself together when it was flying at 3 times the speed of sound. Even the fuel had to be reinvented. Regular jet fuel would have exploded under the SR-71's heat and pressure. So a new chemical mixture was created, one that could survive in temperatures that melted aluminum. It was so stable that the plane couldn't even start its own engines without a special chemical called triethylborane, which exploded into green fire every time the engines ignited. Every takeoff looked like something out of science fiction. Twin bursts of emerald flame marking the start of another impossible flight. But building a plane that fast wasn't enough. It had to be invisible. The team coated the SR-71 in a special radar-absorbing paint that wasn't glossy black by choice. It was black because it had to dissipate heat and scatter radio waves. The shape of the plane was like nothing ever seen before. Long, sharp edges, wings that blended into the body, and twin nacelles designed to trap radar reflections. It didn't glide through the air, it sliced it apart. It was so far ahead of its time that some called it alien. Inside, the systems were equally astonishing. The SR-71's navigation computer had to calculate position using the stars because no radio signal could track it. At 80,000 feet, GPS didn't exist, so they built a celestial navigation system. A mechanical eye that looked to the heavens and guided the aircraft using the constellations. It was old-school astronomy fused with the most advanced engineering on Earth. The Blackbird could find its way across continents faster than a missile. All by watching the stars. Even with all this brilliance, the Blackbird almost never worked. Early test flights ended with fuel leaks, engine blowouts, and near disasters. But the engineers didn't stop. Every failure became a lesson. Every crack in the titanium skin became proof that they were pushing reality to its limit. Over time, the impossible started to hold together. A machine that could travel faster than a bullet, higher than a mountain, and survive temperatures that would melt rock. By the time the SR-71 took to the skies for its first real mission, it wasn't just a plane. It was a prophecy. A glimpse into the future of flight. No aircraft since has ever matched it. The Blackbird was more than the sum of its parts. It was proof that when the limits of physics stand in your way, you don't stop, you rewrite them. The sirens screamed inside the cockpit, and the pilots knew exactly what that sound meant. They had been locked on. A Soviet missile had just launched, slicing through the cold air miles below. Its purpose simple and brutal. Destroy the intruder at any cost. The pilot's heart pounded, but he didn't flinch. There was no time for fear. He pushed the throttles forward, igniting the engines into an inferno of controlled chaos. The roar was deafening, the vibration bone deep. The SR-71 began to climb, not away from the missile but above it. Higher, faster, into a realm where no other aircraft could survive. The temperature outside soared past 600 degrees. The metal skin groaned, expanding, glowing faintly red under the extreme heat. But the Blackbird didn't slow down. It didn't even tremble. It was outrunning death itself. Down below, radar operators frantically tracked the blip that shouldn't have existed. The missile streaked upward at Mach 5, but the SR-71 was already gone, leaving only a ghost on the screen. A shadow that had moved beyond the laws of air combat. No evasive maneuvers, no countermeasures, no flares, just speed, just pure, engineered defiance. The missile in its fury burned itself out before ever getting close. That was the beauty of the Blackbird's design. It didn't need to fight. It simply had to keep moving faster than anything trying to kill it. Inside the cockpit, the pilot sat in silence. Every dial trembled from the force. The suits they wore felt more like armor than uniforms. The world outside had turned from blue to black, the curvature of Earth visible beneath them. A thin, glowing horizon separating the living from the void. At that height, there was no sky, no sound, no rescue if something went wrong. Just the endless hum of the engines, and the steady breath of men who had learned to trust the impossible. Every mission was a dance with fire, and the SR-71 led that dance perfectly. Each time the plane returned to base, the ground crew would gather silently, their faces reflecting awe and disbelief. The aircraft looked battered, black paint scorched, titanium plates streaked with heat scars. But it had done it again. It had gone where no radar could reach, photographed what no satellite could see, and come back untouchable. Every flight felt like an act of defiance against the limits of humanity. What made the SR-71 legendary wasn't just its speed, it was its silence. Every operation it performed was classified. Every story whispered in the dark corners of intelligence briefings. But the legend grew. Pilots spoke of it in hushed tones. The moment the missile warning lit up, the surge of adrenaline, the earth falling away beneath them, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing they had survived the impossible once again. No one ever shot down an SR. Hundreds of missiles were fired, but none could reach it. Each failure left enemies staring helplessly at empty skies. The Blackbird wasn't just outrunning missiles, it was outrunning time itself, pushing the boundaries of technology decades ahead of its era. And every pilot who touched its controls knew the same unspoken truth. Flying the SR-71 wasn't just a mission, it was a brush with immortality. It wasn't armed with guns or bombs, but with the purest weapon mankind had ever created. Speed that made heat turn to light, that bent the air, and left thunder in its wake. The Blackbird didn't win by fighting, it won by existing, by doing what should have been impossible. Every second it stayed in the sky was a victory over physics, over fear, over the very idea of defeat. The SR-71 didn't escape death, it redefined what it meant to chase it.